He wasn't at this reunion for the champagne or the fake smiles. He was there for her. 10 years ago, Gabriella Jones had crushed his soul with a single, icy no. He believed she hadn't spent a single second wondering if he survived the wreckage she left behind. But he had done more than survive. He had conquered. In high school, Alex Williams was a nobody, a scholarship kid in a cheap blazer who loved Gabriella with a desperate, pure honesty. But she had thrown that love away like it was trash. Now, the boy she rejected was dead. In his place stood a titan, a billionaire monster whose name made markets tremble. He adjusted his silk tie, smoothed his bespoke suit, and stepped into the light. The reckoning had finally arrived. The ballroom was a cage of gold and glass, filled with the suffocating scent of expensive perfume. The alumni moved like sharks, all of them desperate to prove they had won the decade. Gabriella stood by the windows, looking like a dream in a midnight blue gown that clung to her curves. Her dark skin was luminous, her curls pinned back like a crown. To everyone else, she was the picture of perfection. But inside? She was a ghost. For 10 years, she had worn a social mask to hide a secret that was eating her alive, the truth about why she had really pushed Alex away. She looked radiant, but her beauty was a shield, forged in a fire Alex knew nothing about. Suddenly, the heavy doors at the end of the hall swung open. The air didn't just turn cold, it froze. The laughter died. The music seemed to stop. Gabriella felt the electric sting on her skin before she even turned around. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she looked toward the entrance. Her eyes widened in absolute terror. There, silhouetted against the city lights, was Alex. He wasn't the soft boy from the library anymore. His jawline was a razor, his expression a fortress of stone, and his eyes, once filled with warmth, were now locked onto hers with the lethal precision of a man who had come to collect a debt. And tonight, he was going to make her pay. The air in the grand ballroom of the Shard in London felt thin, as if the sheer wealth of the alumni was consuming all the oxygen. Gabriella Jones adjusted the weight of her midnight blue gown, the sequins catching the light of the city skyline stretching out beyond the glass. She was a world away from the leafy suburbs of Atlanta where she had grown up, yet tonight, she felt like that scared 17-year-old girl again. Beside her, Chloe, formerly a quiet girl from math class, now a high-powered gallery owner, was recounting a summer spent in Santorini. Gabriella nodded at the appropriate intervals, her smile practiced and perfectly fixed. This was her life now, a series of elegant events, a career in architecture, and a reputation for being as cool and untouchable as the glass towers she helped create. But the poise was a lie. It was a suit of armor she had put on 10 years ago, the day she walked away from the only person who had ever truly seen her. Alex Williams. The name was a silent bruise on her soul. In the quiet hours of the night, she still saw him. She saw the way his eyes had crinkled when he laughed, the ink stains on his fingers from obsessive studying, and the shattered look on his face when she had told him he wasn't enough for her. She had lied to save him. She had watched his wealthy friends prepare to frame him for a theft that would have stripped him of his scholarship. To stop them, she had played the role of the shallow socialite, breaking his heart so he would leave before they could destroy him. She had been his martyr, and he had become her ghost. Gabriella? You've gone distant again, Chloe teased. Are you looking for someone? Before Gabriella could answer, a sudden silence swept through the room. She turned slowly, her hand rising to her cheek. There, framed by the London skyline, stood a man who looked like a king returning to a city he intended to burn. The soft boy was gone. In his place was a man of sharp angles and cold grace. Alex Williams had returned, and as his gaze cut through the crowd to find hers, Gabriella realized the boy she had saved had grown into a man who might never forgive her. Alex Williams did not simply enter the room, he took command of it. As the heavy doors of the ballroom closed behind him, he felt the familiar, icy thrill of being in control. For 10 years, he had lived in the high-stakes world of boardrooms and private jets, building a name for himself out of the pieces of a broken heart. Every deal he closed and every competitor he defeated was a brick in the wall he had built around his soul. He had become a man who used silence as a weapon and success as a shield. His gaze swept across the room, ignoring the fawning stares of his former classmates. They meant nothing to him. He was looking for only one person, the girl who had told him, under a rainy Georgia sky, that he would never be enough for her. He remembered her words more clearly than the hunger of his scholarship years. He had spent a decade turning that pain into fuel. If she wanted a world of power and status, he would build one so large she would have no choice but to see him at the top. Then, he saw her. Gabriella was a vision in midnight blue, standing by the glass as if she were part of the London skyline. She looked exactly like the girl from his dreams, but also like a stranger. He noticed her hand tremble slightly as she touched her cheek, a small crack in her perfect armor. A bitter satisfaction filled him. He didn't want her apologies. He wanted her to feel the weight of what she had thrown away. Alex straightened his cuffs and began to move. He walked with the slow, steady pace of a man who had already won, ready to collect a debt 10 years in the making. The silence followed him like a loyal shadow as Alex crossed the marble floor. The crowd of former classmates parted effortlessly, their whispers dying in his wake, but Alex saw none of them. His focus was locked on the woman in the midnight blue dress. Gabriella felt the air change before he reached her. It became thick and heavy, charged with the electricity of a coming storm. She tightened her grip on her champagne glass, her knuckles turning white, as he stopped just inches from her. Up close, the transformation was even more devastating. The boyish softness she had once cradled in her palms was gone, replaced by the sharp, unforgiving lines of a man who had conquered worlds. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Gabriella," he said. His voice was no longer the hesitant murmur she remembered, it was a deep, resonant silk that made her skin prickle. Gabriella looked up, meeting a gaze that was as cold and beautiful as the city lights outside. "Alex," she breathed, the name catching in her throat like a jagged stone. He didn't smile. He simply stood there, his presence towering and intimidating, forcing her to look at what he had become. The distance between them was barely a foot, yet it felt like a canyon carved by 10 years of silence and lies. "I told you once that I would make you regret that night," he whispered, leaning in just enough for her to catch the scent of expensive sandalwood and steel. "I've spent 3,000 days making sure I kept that promise. How does it feel to finally be right?" Gabriella couldn't move. She could only stare into the eyes of the boy she had saved, realizing that in his eyes, she was the only enemy left to defeat. The scent of expensive sandalwood on the Billionaire in front of her suddenly dissolved into the smell of damp earth and old books. In an instant, Gabriella was back in that rain-soaked parking lot 10 years ago. Before her stood a different Alex, a boy in a hand-me-down blazer with sleeves that were slightly too short and eyes that held the entire world in their gaze. That night, he had held out a small, crumpled envelope containing a poem and a confession of love. He was a scholarship student with nothing to his name but a brilliant mind and a heart that beat only for her. Gabriella remembered the way her own soul had screamed as she forced her face into a mask of cold boredom. She had seen the wealthy school bullies watching from the shadows, ready to trigger a scandal that would have ended his future. To save him, she had to destroy him. "You're just a project, Alex," she had lied, her voice trembling beneath the sound of the rain. "I belong in a world you can't even afford to look at." She had watched the light die in his eyes, replaced by a hollow, haunting silence as he turned and walked away into the dark. Now, that boy was gone. The man standing before her in the London ballroom was a titan of steel and shadows. The hand-me-down blazer had been replaced by a suit that cost more than most people earned in a year. The vulnerability was buried under layers of cold power. As Gabriella looked at him, she realized the tragic irony. She had broken his heart to give him a future, but in doing so, she had turned the boy she loved into a man who lived only for revenge. The tension in the ballroom shifted from a simmer to a boil as Alex began his move. He didn't need to raise his voice, he simply moved through the crowd with the quiet authority of a man who owned the very air they breathed. With a few subtle nods and short words to the event organizers, the flow of the party changed. Waiters steered clear of their corner, and the circle of gossiping alumni suddenly found reasons to be elsewhere, driven away by the cold intensity radiating from the billionaire. Gabriella felt the walls closing in. The friends who had been laughing with her moments ago were now watching from a distance, their eyes filled with a mix of awe and malice. They were the same monsters who had once fueled the fire of her fear, the wealthy heirs and socialites who had forced her hand 10 years ago. Now, they watched like spectators at a duel, sensing that Alex was cornering his prey. "They haven't changed, have they?" Alex asked, his gaze flicking briefly to the crowd before snapping back to her. Still watching, waiting to see who falls first. He stepped closer, effectively trapping her between the glass window and his towering frame. The opulence of the room felt like a cage. By clearing the floor, he had stripped away her defenses, leaving her exposed to the one person who could see right through her polished mask. "You used to hide behind them to stay away from me," he whispered, his voice a low vibration that made her heart race. "But tonight, Gabriella, I've bought the room. There is nowhere left for you to hide." The pressure of the room became too much to bear. Gabriella set her untouched glass on a passing tray and slipped through a side exit, her midnight blue dress shimmering like a dying star under the hallway lights. She just needed to breathe, to escape the suffocating weight of Alex's gaze and the judgment of the people watching them. But the heavy thud of the door closing behind her was followed immediately by the sound of firm, rhythmic footsteps. "Running away again, Gabriella?" She spun around, her back hitting the cold stone wall of the private corridor. Alex stood a few feet away, but the man who had looked like a statue of ice in the ballroom was starting to fray. His tie was slightly loosened, and for the first time, his jaw wasn't set in a perfect, rigid line. The composed billionaire was disappearing, and in his place was someone raw and dangerously close to the surface. "I can't do this, Alex," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I can't stand here and be your villain while you look at me with so much hate." Alex stepped into her personal space, slamming a hand against the wall beside her head. The calm mask he had worn all night finally cracked, revealing a flash of the boy who had been destroyed 10 years ago. His eyes weren't cold anymore, they were burning with a decade of unshed tears and unanswered questions. "You think this is easy for me?" he snapped, his voice cracking with a sudden, jagged emotion. "I built an empire so I could forget you, but every floor of every building I own is just a monument to the girl who said I wasn't enough. Tell me why, Gabriella. Look me in the eye and tell me it was all for nothing." The silence of the hallway was shattered by the raw pain in Alex's voice. Gabriella looked up at him, her eyes brimming with tears she could no longer hold back. The weight of 10 years of silence finally became too heavy to carry. "I didn't say it because it was true, Alex," she cried out, her voice echoing against the cold stone walls. "I said it because they were going to destroy you." Alex froze, his hand still pressed against the wall, his chest heaving. "What are you talking about?" "The night of the gala," Gabriella sobbed, the words tumbling out in a desperate rush. "I found them, Marcus and his friends, in the library. They had stolen the headmaster's watch and planted it in your locker. They were going to call the police and have your scholarship stripped away. You would have gone to jail, Alex. You would have never become the man you are today." The anger in Alex's eyes flickered, replaced by a haunting confusion. You knew? "They told me if I didn't break up with you and make sure you left the school, they would go through with it," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I had to make you hate me. I had to make you leave so you could have a future. I didn't care if you saw me as a monster, as long as you weren't a victim. I broke my own heart to make sure yours could keep beating in a world that didn't deserve you." The air left Alex's lungs as the truth settled over him like a heavy shroud. The empire he had built on a foundation of hate suddenly felt fragile. He looked at Gabriella, not as the villain of his story, but as the girl who had sacrificed everything to save him from the shadows. The hand Alex had slammed against the wall slowly slid down, his fingers uncurling as the strength left them. The air in the narrow hallway, once charged with his cold fury, was now filled only with the sound of Gabriella's soft, broken sobs. He looked at her, really looked at her, and the armor he had spent 10 years forging shattered into 1,000 useless pieces. 10 years, he whispered, his voice thick with a grief so deep it felt like it was coming from a different person. I hated you for 10 years because I thought I wasn't enough. I built all of this, the companies, the towers, the billions, just to prove you wrong. He looked down at his expensive silk sleeves as if they were made of lead. And all this time, you were the only one who was actually on my side. The great exhale finally came, a long, shuddering breath that seemed to pull the poison out of his lungs. The anger that had been his only companion for a decade evaporated, leaving behind a raw, aching love that had never truly died. He reached out, his hand trembling, and gently tucked a stray curl behind her ear. I'm so sorry, Gabriella, he choked out. He didn't sound like a billionaire anymore, he sounded like the boy in the hand-me-down blazer who had just realized he had been fighting the wrong war. He stepped closer, not to trap her this time, but to shield her. He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair as the weight of his mistake crushed him. He had come to London to destroy the woman who broke his heart, only to find that she was the one who had saved his life. The cool night air of the terrace felt like a blessing after the suffocating heat of the ballroom. Below them, London was a sea of shimmering lights, but Alex had eyes only for the woman standing beside him. The silence between them was no longer sharp or heavy, it was a soft, shared space where 10 years of pain were finally beginning to heal. Alex turned to Gabriella, the glow of the city reflecting in his dark eyes. He reached into his pocket, but he didn't pull out a business card or a symbol of his vast wealth. Instead, he pulled out a small, faded piece of paper, the same poem he had tried to give her in that rain-soaked parking lot a decade ago. It was wrinkled and worn, proving he had carried it with him through every boardroom meeting and every country he had conquered. I didn't come here tonight to show you what I built, he said, his voice quiet and steady. I came here because I was still that boy waiting in the rain, hoping you'd change your mind. He took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. The billionaire doesn't need a second chance, Gabriella. But the boy who used to share his lunch with you and walk you home, he does. Gabriella looked at the paper and then at the man who had finally let his walls crumble. The fear was gone, replaced by a hope that burned brighter than the skyline. She squeezed his hand, a tear of joy tracing a path through the sparkle on her cheek. The boy never lost his chance, she whispered. I've been waiting for him to come back for 10 years. As they stood together overlooking the city, the past was finally behind them. It wasn't just a reunion, it was a new beginning, built on a truth that was far more valuable than any fortune.